Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar of the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Persons. Today, we're going to talk about that data visualization on trafficking in persons. The webinar will be providing an overview of current practices in this field, and we have the opportunity to hear from experts working in the leading UN organizations in this field, as well as from representatives of regional organizations collecting statistics on this phenomenon. On my side, my name is Giulia Serio, and I'm a researcher working at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, where I had the opportunity to contribute to the last two global reports on trafficking in persons. So for those of you who may not know or were joining for the first time, we talk about ICAT when we refer to the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Persons. ICAT is a policy forum for anti-trafficking coordination. The coordination group works within the framework of an overall plan of action that focuses on 6 priority areas. And one of these 6 priority areas is building an evidence base on trafficking in persons. At the same time, the annual activities of this group are shaped by its chairs, which are elected on an annual basis. And this year, co-chairs are the International Organization for Migration and the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children. As part of the co-chairing work plan for 2023, the group is focusing on promoting data literacy on trafficking in persons. 6 webinars are planned in this series, and they will run through November 2023. They will be posted on the NOTS platform. When I talk about the NOTS platform, it is the UNODC Knowledge Center in Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling. So it's a website hosting the webinars. If you opted out of NOTS during the registration, you can still be able to access the webinar recordings on the website, and in general, you'll be able to find this and much more material on the NOTS website anytime. I would like to start by giving the floor to the first speaker, Claire Gallis-Davis from the International Organization for Migration. So Claire is a data scientist. She's been working in the protection division of the Department for Program Support and Migration Management at IOM, and will tell you more about their data collection initiatives on trafficking persons. Claire, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for this introduction. So as Julia said, my name is Claire Gallis-Davis. I work at IOM headquarters in the protection division, and I'm part of the team that manages the Counter-Trafficking Data Collaborative, or CTDC, which I'm going to talk to you about today. But before I go into details about the CTDC and what it is, I would like to tell you a little bit more about the rationale behind CTDC and what we call the human trafficking information gap. So on the one side, there is a big demand for data on trafficking in persons and research, but not a lot of it for various reasons, notably because trafficking is a crime and therefore meant to go undetected. It's not easy to have information and data on it. But on the other hand, a lot of data do exist and are being collected by a variety of different actors, probably daily. For example, courts, law enforcement, civil society organization, and even IOM as part of case management, and so on. So this looks a bit like a paradox, but what are the obstacles to using and sharing this data? Well, the first, and probably one of the most important, is the data privacy concerns. If we are talking about personal data and personal data about victims of trafficking, then of course there are some ethical and privacy concerns that arise, and rightly so. Another issue is that a lot of these different databases that I'm talking about are diverse. Sometimes they use different definitions of trafficking in persons. Sometimes they operationalize them differently. Sometimes they collect different information depending on what they need, because the primary purpose of this type of data collection is not data collection itself. Data collection is a little bit of a byproduct. And then as a consequence, data are not standardized or comparable. Databases are dispersed and disconnected. And there is a lack of technical resources and solution to palliate to all these issues. But there are solutions to all these obstacles, and they're shown on the slides. Of course, Data privacy concerns can be alleviated, at least to some extent, with the proper de-identification techniques. It's possible to standardize data to make it a bit easier to merge, and then providing an open data publishing platform can provide some resources. So a little bit more about IOM before we go into CTDC. I mentioned already that IOM does collect data on trafficking in persons. The reason for that is that IOM assists about 7,000 to 8,000 victims of trafficking every year and is the largest actor globally in this regard. And as part of these assistance activities, IOM has to collect a certain amount of information on the victims that it assists. It's the basics like date of birth, gender or sex, but also a lot broader information. And I'll get into that in more details in a little bit later. So all of this is recorded in a case management system, which we call Mimosa. And Mimosa now has the largest database of its kind in the world, with nearly 80,000 cases of trafficking in persons, and nearly 5,000 cases are added every year. And so what we do in our team is that we try and safely and ethically use this data to learn more about trafficking in persons, and as far as possible, make it available for other researchers as well. And this is how IOM created CTDC, because there is extremely valuable data on the phenomenon of trafficking in the Mimosa database. This type of exploitation, whether it's sexual exploitation or forced labor, and if the person was trafficked for the purpose of forced labor, there's a sector of exploitation. For example, is it construction, is it domestic work, and so on. There's information about how the person entered the trafficking process, how they were recruited, how they were controlled, how they were kept into the trafficking process. There's also some information on the perpetrators of trafficking as reported by the victims, etc. And so IOM, in partnership with the CTDC partners, launched the Counter-Trafficking Data Collaborative, CTDC, in 2017, in an effort to make all of this data safely and widely available. So as I was saying, IOM is not the only CTDC contributor. We also work with Polaris, which is a US trafficking hotline, and Recollective, which used to be called Liberty Shared, and was providing case management services to NGOs, at first in Southeast Asia, and then now they've expanded. And these were the two most ancient partners, the two foundational partners. And since then, we've also welcomed A21, which is an NGO, and also the Portuguese Observatory of Trafficking in Human Beings, our first government partner. So with all these partners, we now have a data set of over 156,000 records, including 187 victim nationalities and 189 countries of exploitation. So this is to show you a little bit about the overlaps and differences between the different data sets and the kind of issues that we had to work through as we created a common standard for the CTDC, for all the CTDC partners. I said before that databases were often diverse and disconnected, but there are some overlaps. If people are working under the Palermo definition of trafficking, you still have to identify the three elements: act, means, and purpose. But there are important variations that needed to be addressed, and a few of them are shown on this slide. For example, IOM is an international organization and therefore works under the international definition of trafficking in persons, whereas Polaris works on the US legal definition. IOM collects data through client interviews, whereas Polaris is a hotline, etc. Now, I'd like to go into a bit more detail about what you can find on the CTDC. So this is a big screenshot, and I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what you can explore. First are the visualizations. So these, we also call them data stories. These are thematic pages on different aspects of trafficking in persons, and they provide statistics. For example, you'll have some on the gender of victims, you'll have some on the age difference between children and adults. There are also interactive dashboards that you can have a look at. We also have maps. So there's a basic CTDC map which shows bubbles for country of citizenship of victims and country of exploitation of victims. We also have corridor maps, so linking citizenship and exploitation and seeing the frequent corridors. As is shown on the screen, also we have a timeline, we have a route map, and we've also used the UK's national referral mechanism data, which is freely available online, and we've turned it into a map. So that's also available on there. And the maps are interactive, so you can click on the bubbles, on countries, and see the statistics. So here are some selected findings that you'll be able to find through the data stories, dashboards, or maps. Unsurprisingly, you'll see that 73% of the victims in a CTDC database are women or girls, and 67% of these women or girls reported having been sexually exploited, and that compares to 85% of gender diverse victims and 14% of boys and men. And we do have a data story on male victims trafficked into sexual exploitation, and we find that 53% of them were children. In terms of types of exploitation, sexual exploitation and forced labor are the most frequent exploitations reported by victims. And we also have the sector of forced labor, as you can see on the slide, with domestic work, construction, agriculture, being the three most frequently reported sectors. So here I'm showing the general figures, but of course there are important age and gender patterns. For example, children tend to report begging and peddling more frequently. Women and girls tend to report domestic work more frequently, whereas men and boys tend to report construction more frequently, etc. Victims who are interviewed by IOM as part of the assistance activities can also report on the means of control that were used to keep them within the trafficking process. And they can also talk about the perpetrators that they've encountered. And so what we found is that men and boys tend to report earnings confiscation as a means of control, whereas women and girls tend to report threats, among many other means of control. And it's frequent that victims have report several means of control. In terms of recruitment, men and boys are more likely to report being recruited by a friend or acquaintance, whereas women and girls are recruited by all three groups that we have in the database, which is friends or relative or intimate partner. And then we found that children are overwhelmingly recruited with some sort of family involvement. It's unclear to what extent the family knows that it's trafficking, but nevertheless they are somehow involved. So the last main element on the website in terms of data visualization is that we've made data sets available online for people to download and to use themselves and create their own analysis and their own visualizations. So you'll have a choice of 3 different data sets you can download. The kind of historic one is the K-anonymized data set, which is a data set that's de-identified through K-anonymization. K-anonymization is essentially a process of removing unusual victim profiles of the data set. So if we take a victim and this victim is identical to 10 others in the data set, then we keep her or him. If they are not identical to at least 10 other victims, then they are redacted from the data set. More recently, though, we've been working with Microsoft Research on a synthetic data algorithm. So it's essentially it creates a pipeline in which we put the raw CTDC data, and the algorithm transforms into a synthetic data set that preserves the statistical properties of the initial data sets, but it's a lot more complete compared to the anonymized data set, but it's also very safe. So there's a global synthetic data set, which is a synthetic data set of victims, but then last year in December, we launched a victim perpetrator synthetic data set also. So I'd like to say very briefly a little bit more about the identification, because it's really a key issue for us. Once data are published online, it's even if we end up removing the link or removing the visualizations, it's, we need to assume that it's always going to be there. So we are very conservative in our approach to the identification and to what we publish. One of our main questions that we have to address before when deciding whether to publish something or not is, if I were a perpetrator with prior knowledge of the victim, would I be able to identify that victim in the data set? This is something we, among other things, that we always think about. And we have 3 main steps or 3 main ways in which we address those concerns. First is through data shared by CTDC partners. When we receive data from Polaris or the other partners, we make sure that no identifying information are shared. So they're not sharing any names, any date of birth, any addresses, etc. There is also a reduction in details. For example, they don't share the age, but they share age category. And this is what powers the visualizations. And then we put data sets online, as I've explained, with anonymization and synthetic data. And finally, on the map, if you navigate, you'll see that there are some custom de-identification, mostly with threshold. So if you click on a small bubble, you might have the notification that we do not publish data for groups under 10 people. So this is it for my presentation. I just would like to end by saying that we welcome contributions from various counter-trafficking stakeholders, not just on victim data. And you're free to email the CTDC email if you want to collaborate, whether it's sharing data or suggestions on visualizations even. You're very welcome to reach out to us. And yes, I think that's it. So thank you very much for this great opportunity to present CTDC. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Claire. So I would like to introduce already the second speakers, Cheryl Wilson and Aurélie Wong from the International Labour Organization. So Cheryl and Aurélie work at the Fundamentals, Principles and Rights at Work branch at the ILO, and I will tell you more about their forced labour observatory. Cheryl, Aurélie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. We are really happy to join this webinar today, as it's really about joining forces on how we can better give a better access to data on forced labor and trafficking. And we are really happy to present you the Forced Labor Observatory that was developed, that we commonly call FLOW, that was developed by the ILO, and it's a really nice transition after our colleague from IOM, because here we are looking to complement the work they're doing on collecting data on cases, to look more at the data on the policy level. To give you a bit of background, the request came directly from ILO constituents. So as you know, the ILO is a tripartite agency, so we have representatives from governments, but also from employers and workers organizations, and they came to the ILO governing body and asked us to develop this global data where are some forced labor and trafficking. The idea behind it was that there's really good data available. We have data on cases, as it was just discussed. We have other databases on legislation, for instance, so on policy levels, action plans, what different types of assistance measures, but they were all scattered in different places. So the idea was not to reinvent the wheel, but just to provide a one-stop shop where you could find linkages to those different data sets and find reliable information on forced labor that could then influence and inform policy action on forced labor. So our target users are quite large. It includes international, regional, national stakeholders, researchers, also working with the Alliance 8.7 to achieve the 8.7 sustainable goal to end forced labor, trafficking and child labor. So also working with the partner countries and also donors. And it was developed under with different sources of funding, but most recently mainly with US dollar funded bridge project. The bottom line for us was really to use reliable source and to be as comprehensive as possible. So now we have country profile for each of the ILO member states, and we are paying a lot of attention to which data we are using. So whenever possible, we use primary sources and reputable sources. So we reference a lot of data from the UN, including several ICAT members. We give access to data from UNODC, ICMPD, IOM, UNICEF, OHCHR, among others. As you will see, for each single information, we provide a direct link to the flow. The idea is not to limit the people to stay on our site, but on the contrary, to give them kind of an abstract, an overview of whatever exists in that country on this topic, and then they can go to the direct source of the information. We also put a lot of emphasis on the validation process. So we dedicated a significant amount of time to consolidate the different type of data we had collected. So we now receive, for instance, a lot of direct information from countries as well. We'll send their input, but the validation process has remained unchanged in the sense that we want a reputable source and public sources. So we won't be able to include an information if it's not attached to public and reputable source. The official launch was in December last year, and we keep updating because as we know, the database are only interesting if they're always up to date. So we keep updating country profile on a regular basis. And we're also trying to develop new features to make the database more user-friendly. So as you see, it's still a very recent database. So we're still in the process of improving it to make some new features available, to make some specific queries among the data and so forth. As we're talking about updates and sustainability, we are also working to try to have as much automation as possible. So we have already generated some automatic updates for certain fields with some ILO databases. For instance, we have the ILO databases on ratification and on the report from our own supervisory system that monitors the way the convention which have been ratified are implemented. So we have already generated some automatic updates in that field. And we also, as I was saying, encourage users to send us information, to flag information that would need to be updated. Beyond that, we are also discussing potential partnership with other UN sister agencies, such as UNODC, for instance, because we're already using their data, but we're trying to explore ways in where we could automate some of the updates so that each time they are producing this new reports on trafficking, it could automatically be visible on the Flow platform, as well as with Alliance 8.7 and other projects. I already mentioned the funding, so it's currently being funding through a project that ends end of next year with some ILO regular budget, but obviously we're also discussing potential partnership to ensure sustainability so that it stays updated and more automated as much as possible. I will now leave the floor to Cheryl that will go more into details in the database. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Aurélie. So as you can see from the screen at the moment, each country profile is divided into 8 sections. So we start with qualitative and quantitative data, then we cover the international framework, national institutional framework, enforcement, prevention, protection, access to justice and remedies, and cooperation. So now I'll present the website. So you'll see that when we land on the Forced Labour Observatory, as already mentioned, we have country profiles for all 187 ILO member states. So you can reach the country profiles by clicking on the map or clicking the country below, or on the left, there's also an option to select your country or search the country itself. On the left-hand navigation pane, we have global maps, which show different information. So for example, we have a map of relevant ratified ILO instruments by country. So we can see which countries have ratified C29, P29, or Convention 105 as well. And also the ratification status by country. There's also the option to filter, for example, looking at those that have ratified the protocol on forced labor. And we have all of that information there, and then you can go directly to the country profile. We also have other information which follows the structure of the country profiles that I've just presented. For example, the legal framework. So we can see which countries have a legal framework which covers forced labor and related concepts, such as those that cover slavery, trafficking, forced labor, bonded labor, and modern slavery. Also by country as well. There's other maps, I won't go into detail on all of them, but another one which might be interesting is the assistance measures for victims. So we can see which countries have different measures of assistance to victims, also by the type of measure, so whether that's shelter, medical assistance, or vocational training as well, and then the number of measures in place. So just to give you an example, if we go to the country profile for Peru, at the beginning, usually when you reach the page, you'll see the different sections, and then you can go to which section you find relevant. There's an opportunity to download the PDF and also to expand the country profiles with all of the information as well. So if I look, for example, as already mentioned, we collect information on forced labour victims identified. So here we're looking at forced labour victims identified by age and sex, and also by form of exploitation. And you can see that we're using the UNODC tip report. And as mentioned by Aurélie, each and every entry, we have the original source. So if we click on this, it then takes us to the UNODC report. Some other information include legal cases. We also have information on the national framework, as we saw earlier, and then information on the details within the legal framework and the different laws and policies that are in place as well. So it's very comprehensive. And then there's different sections related to enforcement as well, coordination, prevention, awareness raising, protection, and so on. And as mentioned, everything has a link to the original source. So we just wanted to give you a brief snapshot of what the website looks like. And as mentioned by Aurélie, this is really a collaborative effort. We really depend on receiving new information. So we know that everyone participating in this webinar, we all work on forced labor and trafficking in one way or another. So if there is information on the website that you see is, not up to date, or you have new information, please send us an email, which is flow@ilo.org, and then we'll be able to make those updates, because we really depend on everyone for us to be able to keep this updated. And we look forward to hearing from you. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Aurélie and Cheryl. And I'll introduce you to the third speaker, Giorgio Telloli from Eurostat. So Giorgio is a seconded national expert working on crime and criminal justice statistics at Eurostat, and she'll present us the experience of a regional organization collecting this data. Giorgio, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie, for the presentation, and thank you for giving us the possibility to present our visualization tool, and also to meet all the other data producer and the participant to this webinar, so interested in trafficking human being data. Okay. So we start briefly with the role of Eurostat, and on our data collection. I think it's important to understand what is behind the data and all the work that is behind the data and where the data comes from. Then we will end with the visualization tool. The requirement for collect data for the EU member state comes from an EU directive. On the basis of this directive, member state should establish in each country national rapporteurs or equivalent mechanism whose task is to monitor the trends of trafficking human beings, to gather data, to monitor the policies of anti-traffic misuse, and to report. So Eurostat provides support to the Directorate General for Migration and Home Affairs to carry out this data collection exercise, preparing, launching the data collection, but also assessing the quality and disseminate the data. We cover the period since 2008 in our data, and we collect data from the Crime and Criminal Justice Statistics Eurostat contact point that are mainly national statistical institutes, but also other national authorities appointed for this role, and together with the national rapporteur. A very important step in this data collection was in 2022 when we joined the data collection with the GLOTIP questionnaire by UNODC, the global report on trafficking in persons. So we received an Excel file with aggregate data, and the GLOTIP is automatically filled with the data that are in our Excel file, and UNODC as a direct access to the folder, and they can pick up the questionnaire by themselves. So which data do we collect? We collect data on victims, four main parts we have in the questionnaire. We collect data on victims, on suspected traffickers, on prosecuted traffickers, and on convicted traffickers. For all of this legal status, we have a table for sex and age group, a table for sex, age group, and citizenship, sex, age group, and form of exploitation. Therefore, victims, we have more tables, sex and registering organizations, citizenship and form of exploitation, and for all national victims, we have also the place of exploitation. We have also important, these are the data that we collect. Also, we collect very important data that are the data on the final decisions by the prosecution service and the final decision of the courts. And we cannot disseminate all this data because we assess the quality and we assess the quality and also the completeness, mainly the completeness of this data. And if the completeness is not enough, we cannot disseminate the data. So you can see here the number of member states providing data. The number has increased for almost all the tables in recent years. The most filled tables are the one on victims, but also for suspected and prosecuted and convicted. At least we have the total number by sex and age. And the number is also expected to grow this year. What about the timeline? We have a deadline for collecting data, end of July, but usually the slower country finish to send the data at the end of the year because they have to collect data for many different sources. They have the National Rapporteur for Victims, they have the prosecutions, the police for suspected, the prosecution service for prosecuted, and courts for convicted. That means that it requires some time. So data are disseminated as soon as they are validated, usually in January of the following year. So we run some validation of the data. There are already automatic controls in the file to check all the inconsistency in breakdowns with totals and between tables of each legal status. That means that the victim should be the same number on all the breakdowns that I showed you before. And we check the consistency with the previous year. So if there is a big change with the previous year in the numbers, we come back to the country and we ask an explanation for that. And then we check the consistency between the different sources through the attrition rate. That means that the number of victims, offenses, suspected, prosecuted, and convicted are expected to be different, but they should be differences should be realistic. We cannot have a very high number of prosecuted and very low number of convicted. So this number should be into a range that should be realistic. Then we check all the empty tables, we check the use of zero, large use of other values, the notes, the metadata, that are all the information that we ask for each table in the questionnaire. So in case of any inconsistency, any shortcomings, we come back to the country and we ask for correction or explanation. We do not do ourselves adjustments or estimates on the data. This could seem trivial, but it's extremely important. That is the consistency with the definition of the crime. So we refer to the definition that is in the International Classification of Crime for statistical purposes, the ICCS, the definition of trafficking in person. But then we highlight the difference with other crimes that are very similar, very close to trafficking, that the smuggling of migrants, that we know that in theory it is a very different crime. One is a crime against the person and the other one is a crime against the states. But in reality, they're really connected. So it's important to highlight the difference. And another very thin boundary is in sexual exploitation and forced labor without trafficking. According to the guidelines, they should not be counted, included under the trafficking. But we can see also here in reality, the boundary, we can see that it's very thin. We know that maybe sometimes it could also happen that prosecutor use this force because they are easier to be proved, to be brought in front of the court because they don't have all the elements of the trafficking to be proved. So these are all crimes that are very linked. It's important always to understand the consistency of the crime and to ask a country to provide us information on the consistency with the crime. We had many improvements in recent years. We really try to avoid the double counting of victims. We ask country to provide only to provide the same victim only by one registering organization and not from many registering organizations. But this is still a challenging point for for countries. Also now we saw that the multiple forms of exploitation were growing in the recent years. So now we allow to count these small forms of exploitation. We provide category for these sexual and labor, sexual and other, labor and other, and other multiple forms. In this way, we keep the consistency with the number of victims. We have one form of exploitation for each victims. At the same time, we keep tracks of these multiple forms of exploitation. Then I can go to the visualization tool. Okay, so on Eurostat website, we have a very large database with a lot of data set. This is only the part of crime and criminal justice. We have some data set here, and we have a folder for trafficking human beings. We have 3 data sets here. The first is person involved in trafficking human beings by legal status and sex. That means victims suspected and convicted by sex, male and female, and total, and victims of trafficking human beings by citizenship. The category here are home country, other EU country, non-EU country. And then we have victims of trafficking by all forms of exploitation. Here the category are sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, and other forms of exploitation. Let's see the first one. Okay, so here you can see at the top you have information about the data set. So there are information about all the variables and all the categories for each variable. Here we have the explanatory text, the metadata that are very important for us, where we provide information on the definitions, the consistency with the definitions. There are information on methodology. There are all the comments that are provided by the countries, and also there are information on publications, and there are information on the registering system, national system for registering victims for each country. So it is important to refer to metadata to understand better the data. Here we can download the data set, so we can download only this page. We can download a custom data set. I will show later on how we can customize. And we can download the full data set. That means all the variables with all the data for this data set. We can download it in Excel, but also in other plain format that are easily uploadable in other software. Okay, so for example, here we have a table. I showed you before. Here we can format this table. So for example, I don't like a country, I prefer codes, for example. So here I can have the codes, or I can change the decimal symbol, dot or comma. I can change the thousands symbol. I can hide the empty rows, or I can use color. For example, I want class color, so less class or more class of color, and different also kind of color. I also can hide the number, and so I can customize the table. Then go on the variables here. Here I have the number of suspected, total number. I have all the countries here and the year here. We have 10 years out of 14 that are available. For example, now I want also the sex, not only the total number. So I select here all the category for sex, and I put the sex here. And so now I will have a European Union total, male and females, and so for each country. For example, I want all the total before and then male and female, so I can change here. So, and the same also for the column. I don't want only the number, but I want also the ratio, 100,000 inhabitants. So I can add the ratio, for example, in column here. So now I have for each year the number and the ratio per 100,000 inhabitants. So I can really do what I prefer with this table. Then let's go to see the graph, line, bar, and map. So now I prepare to see the graph. We want to see the ratio, so we can make a kind of comparison. And okay, we want to see victims. Okay, so now we can go to see the line. Okay, so here first we have the years, and the default is displayed the EU total. This is the ratio per 100,000 inhabitants. But then I want to add other countries. So, for example, I want to see Belgium or the Netherlands or France, for example. And okay, so here I have all the countries. So I can add the country that I prefer. You can see Netherlands is a very high value compared to the European average, because they have in place a system since many years to detect all the victims, also the presumed victims. And okay, so the same, I can go to the bar. So when I go to the bar, I have just 1 year, so it's 21, but then I can change it to 20, to 19, so I can change, move to the other year, and the same for the map. I have the map here. So also here the year is 28, I want to see 2021, and I have the ratio for the countries. Here I have victim now, but I want to go suspected, for example. And so I can change and play and visualize all the data that I prefer. So just to finish, we present also the data in article, very easy article. They are called Statistics Explained. So we have an article for trafficking human being, where also it's completed by a glossary that clarify all the definitions. And also we have news articles that are released on the main page when every time new data are disseminated, and also all these articles are mentioned news that social media. Yes, so this is the Statistics Explained article where you can find explanation and analysis of data. Just to finish, on our website, you can find all the methodological publication covering also THB topic and all the other information on data, methodology, quality legislation regarding these topics. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Giorgia. In the meantime, if you allow me to just wrap up a bit the main points of that we heard today, I think something that is extremely interesting when looking at trafficking persons data is that it talks about people, and talks about people who have been victims of serious crimes. But we're also talking about people who are at risk of re-victimization. We know that the people who are most likely to fall victims of trafficking persons are people who have already been victimized once in their life. So there are, for instance, also different data protection measures that we need to take. And there is also a third aspect, which I found extremely interesting across all the presentation, which is that we talk not only about people, but about those people who reported the crime, right? So we're talking about hard to reach populations that are not reflected in general surveys, that are usually not visible in the public discourse, but that we're trying to give some visibility to. But we need to be mindful that the people that we reflect in our data is only those people who managed to report their crime, and that in most cases actually got out of their trafficking situations by themselves. So they were so strong and resourceful to actually get out of the situations in which they were in and report this to the authority. And then we were lucky enough for the authorities to actually report it to all this organization who collect the data. So the points that we need to consider when we display data on trafficking in persons is also that we only refers to reported victims. They do not represent the reality of the crime. We have no pictures today of what's the profile of the victims of trafficking in the world. We have a picture of the profile of the victims of trafficking who report the crime. So we know who are those who are more likely to come to the attention of the authorities. And when we talk about their experience, we need to make sure that the considerations about gender, for instance, or about inclusivity are well taken into account across our publications, right? So we're talking about people, we're probably going to use some specific data visualization options, icons, or other types of visuals. And we need to make sure that we represent accurately the diversity of this experience, and that we represent it in a dignified way that, of course, does not, that fully respects the suffering of the victims. I'll maybe start by giving the floor to Claire from IOM so that she can answer the first two questions on the process of submitting data to CTDC from service providers and the data aggregation techniques. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Julia. And so I think this is a question from Olga. What is the process of submitting the data to CTDC from service providers and other organizations? So here I will paste email address in the chat that you can reach out to. So you can reach out to this email address, and from there we can, I think the next best thing then is to schedule a meeting to understand a little bit better what data you're collecting, which which countries, sometimes it's country focus. Is it only children? Is it only women? Does the organization work with IOM or another of the partners to see how to avoid then duplication? And then there's, of course, the need for a data sharing agreement, a legal agreement to iron out the processes. And that can take a bit of time. But we already have the legal agreements with the existing partners, which we can reuse, or we can at least start with as a base. And then after that, we'll need to map the data. And this relates to Fatimata's question, which I also answered by typing. How do we reconcile variables in different data sets in the process of data analysis? So that comes before data analysis. Maybe it can also be whilst the data sharing agreement is being signed or after. And basically, then we have to go through the different variables that are being collected and then see if they can be mapped onto the CTDC data dictionary, and if so, how. For this one, it's useful to be all sitting together on the table and discuss this. It doesn't have to be one-to-one mapping, but in most cases, there is still quite a bit of overlap. But yes, first step is please feel free to reach out to the CTDC email address that I pasted in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. Thanking you all for taking the time today to participate in this webinar on trafficking persons data and research. I thank also our excellent speakers for the presentation, for the material provider. I also would like to thank all ICAT members for promoting the webinar series, the ICAT Secretariat at UNODC, the Notes Tech team at UNODC for the great support, and the ICAT co-chairs for supporting this initiative. I'll now wish you a very good day, and we look forward to seeing you all again for the 5th webinar in the series, which will take place in late October and focus on the ethics of trafficking persons research. Thank you very much for your attention once again, and have a very good day.